Yoma, Daf Mem through Mem Vav. On Daf Mem, the Gemara has a discussion about whether the gorel, the lottery, to determine which of the two seirim, the two goats, would go La Hashem, be offered as a carbon, and which would go La Azazel. The Gemara discusses whether that gorel is essential, whether it's ma'akev. The Gemara tries to bring a raya. The Talmidim asked Rabbi Akiva, Allah b'smol. If the gorel that was La Hashem came up in the left hand of the Kohen Gadol, they usually want it to be the right hand sire. Can they redo the gorel? Ma'al sheyachzir liyamin. So he said, don't do that. Al titnu makom laminin or litzdukin lirdos. Don't give the heretics, the sectarians, those who challenge the chachamim, don't give them the opportunity to say, oh, you just make it up, you just do whatever you want, you don't really follow the rules. You're making it seem like we tell everyone we have rules, but we don't follow those rules when they're inconvenient for us. So the Gemara says that's the whole reason you can't switch the gorel. If the gorel's ma'akev, then the gorel's ma'akev. So the Gemara says we can say the gorel's not ma'akev, and the proposal was that if the gorel came up as small, they would just move that sire with the gorel to the other side to make it be a min, but they would honor the outcome of the gorel. And even that, Rabbi Akiva said you shouldn't do, because that would still give our opponents the opportunity to say, you're not really playing by the rules, you're just doing whatever you want and only invoking the rules when it's convenient. This idea was invoked by Rabbi Halachos Abramsky. Great controversy over whether gelatin is kosher or not. Gelatin is an animal product. Now they make it from fish also, but it's traditionally gelatin was made from animals. If the animal wasn't kosher, if it wasn't a kosher animal that underwent a proper shechita, there was a question as to whether the gelatin would be kosher or not. There were various technical arguments for why it might be kosher. Anyway, Rabbi Halachos Abramsky argued that even if in halacha we could make an argument that gelatin is technically kosher, we shouldn't do it, he said. We shouldn't make the argument because until now, he says, there was a widespread perception that gelatin comes from a treif animal and a non-kosher animal, it has to be usher. Now we're going to say we have a clever, intricate argument for why it's really mutter. People are not going to understand that, he says. People are going to say that this is just going to support the attitude of people that when there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. This is going to support the deya hameshubeshes, the erroneous attitude, and the futzer kol kach b'darenu that is so widespread in our generation that some people deliberately say this, some people just don't understand the halachic process. They're going to say that Isser v'heter is up to the rabbis, they do whatever they want. And this is what our Gemara means. We can't give ammunition to our enemies to just say, we make it up as we go along. Even if we know that technically what we're saying is halachically valid, if the enemies won't understand that, if the opponents of halacha, if the opponents of the rabbinic tradition will just say, you see, it's all made up anyway, you just change the rules whenever it pleases you, you can't do that. So even if gelatin could technically be argued to be mutter, we shouldn't do that because people wouldn't see that as being a fair application of the halachic process. On Daf Mem Aleph, the Gemara talks about the ritual of the Sar HaMishalech, the goat that was thrown off the cliff to Azazel. It says they took a Lashon Shel Zaharis, a strip of crimson, and they tied it to the head of the Sar HaMishalech. They tied it on Yom Kippur. Tying knots, kosher, is a malacha deraisa. It's one of the 39 malachas. You can't do it on Shabbos, you can't do it on Yom Kippur. So how can they tie knots to the Lashon Shel Zaharis? Various Achronim asked the question. Some say it was considered a part of the Avoda. The Avoda, we know, involved many things that were violations of Shabbos. The Shechita and other things were malachas deraisa, and they're mutter anyway. So some say the Lashon Shel Zaharis, tying it on, was also part of the ritual, and therefore it was mutter. But there is another possibility, another way to explain why it was permitted to tie the Lashon Shel Zaharis. The halacha is, the sin qua non of a kesher, of a knot, to be a malacha deraisa, is it has to be kesher shel kayam, a permanent knot. If it's not a kesher shel kayama, there are different levels of impermanence. Sometimes it's drabanan, sometimes it's mutter entirely, but it can't be deraisa if it's not a kesher shel kayama. So therefore, poskim have a debate. Contemporary poskim, the last century or so, have a debate. Let's say you have a knot that you never plan to untie. However, you only really need it to be tied for a relatively brief duration. You're going to throw it away after that. You're tying something and you're never going to untie it, but you're not going to be interested in the whole product after a brief period of time. Contemporary example is diapers. After you take the diaper off the baby, sometimes people seal up the diaper. They reseal the diaper to keep the contents from falling out and making a mess. So if it's only Velcro, that's not kosher at all. But if it's sticky tab, something that actually might be considered kosher, then if it's kesher shel kayama, it's a much more serious issue. If it's kesher she'ein shel kayama, there's more basis for leniency. So how do we view this? When you reseal the diaper, is that kayama or is that not kayama? You only care for the next few hours until it goes out to the garbage and is out of your house. After that, it can open up into the garbage bag. It may not bother you very much, but you never plan to untie it. You're not going to look at it again. Is that called kesher shel kayama or kesher she'ena shel kayama? Maral Diskin discussed a version of this question. Maral Diskin said it's pashut. Wasn't talking about a diaper, but he was talking about in general. If you have a kesher that you're never going to untie, that even though you're never going to untie it, if you don't need it, if you don't care about it for more than a brief period of time, that's malacha shein tzrika legufa. That's not called kesher shel kayama daraisa, and that would not have the chumrah of kesher shel kayama. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach initially held the stringent view, but then he changed his mind. He's recorded as having ruled that if you don't care about it past a brief period of time, even though you never plan to undo it, that would still not be called kesher shel kayama. That would not be called kesher shel kayama, and therefore that would be another basis for leniency in the tying the lashon shel zaharis onto the sarah mishtaleach, because even if they never planned to untie it, they only needed it for the duration of the ritual. Once it fell down at the bottom of the mountain, they didn't need it to be there anymore, and therefore, arguably, it wouldn't be considered, according to some poskim, kesher shel kayama. Other poskim disagree. Rav Belsky is cited as having held that's usher, that you're not allowed to do that, that we consider it kayama. But Rosh Zalman held that reselling the diaper, even if it has the status of kosher, is mutter because it's not considered kesher shel kayama. On Daf Mem Beis, the Gemara talks further about this lashon shel zaharis, the crimson strip that was tied to the sarah mishtalech. The Gemara says there were actually several cases in halacha where we use a crimson strip. The paraduma, the sarah mishtalech, the mitzara, all these rituals involve a lashon shel zaharis. The Gemara says they had different weights. The Gemara brings different opinions about what the weights were. Asara zuz, 10 zuz, 2 slime, which is 8 zuz, shekel, which is 2 zuz. And there's a question, which is which has these different shiurim. So Ravin said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, shel para, that shel para is mishkal asara zuz, 10 zuz for the para, sarah mishkalech is 2 slime, mitzara is mishkal shekel. Then Rabbi Yochanan said, pligi baroshem mechalafta v'rabbanan, b'para. Para is actually machlokes tanoim. One says mishkal asara, the upper end, 10 zuz, and the other one said the lower end, 2 zuz. But nobody said the middle. For para, there's a machlokes, but it's one of the extremes. It's either the lightest, smallest lashon shel zaharis of only a shekel, only 2 zuz, and the other one is the other extreme of 10 zuz, the largest. Nobody says in between. Simanecha, the simon to remember that the two opinions about the lashon of the para are the two extremes, is echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamet. That God values equally the ani and the asher, Mishnah Menachos, who give different size karbanos. One can afford more, one can afford less. It's all equally chashuv in Hashem's eyes. Everyone gave according to his ability. Everyone gave what he can afford. It's equally chashuv to Hashem. This rule about echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamet, it's just being invoked here as a simon, but in a halachic context, the Mishnah Menachos is just saying it as an inspirational thing, as a matter of hashkafa, that God values it equally. This is actually invoked lahalacha in a major tshuva of the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek, the early one of Nicholsburg, several hundred years ago, he was discussing the question of democracy. Communities had some type of local democratic government, and typically the system had been that all the taxpayers got to vote in this democratic procedure. There was a proposal to change the rules that only those who paid significant taxes would get to vote. That the taxpayers who paid only a small amount would no longer get a say in the management of municipal affairs. Obviously, the poorer people, the people who paid less taxes, didn't like this proposal. They said, we're paying what we can afford. Everyone pays what they're assessed. Everyone pays. It's hard for us to pay this as well. It may be harder for a poor person to pay his share of the taxes than the rich person. The rich person has lots of money. Poor person doesn't have as much money. So who's right? Can the rich people say only the upper level taxpayers, the upper tier taxpayers get to vote, or can the poorer people demand that anyone who pays taxes gets to vote? Tzemach Tzedek sides squarely with the poorer people, the more egalitarian position. He says it's wrong to deprive them of the franchise. As proof, he brings this rule, echad hamarbe ve'echad hamamet. The usher brings a more expensive carbon, the ani brings a cheaper carbon. It's all equal in Hashem's eyes. And he goes even further. He says it's harder for the ani to bring his small amount. Therefore, he says it's a big leap, but he jumps from this to governance. Since the Mishnah says, the Gemara says, Hashem cares equally for the carbon of the ani and the asher, Therefore, when it comes to democratic representation, they're equally entitled to have a voice in municipal affairs, and therefore it's not appropriate to deprive them of their right to vote. On Mem Gimel, the Gemara discusses the ritual of making the Efer Para and putting it into the water of the Para Duma water. So it says that the Mishnah says, the Gemara brings the Mishnah, Hakol Ksherin Lekadesh, everyone is allowed to do the Kiddush ritual, which is putting the ashes in the water, except the Tanakama says 3 people can't do it. Chere, Shota, V'kata, a deaf mute, someone who is mentally incapacitated, and a minor. Rabbi Yehuda Machshir B'katan. Rabbi Yehuda says a katan is able to do it. The Gemara explains what's the machlokas, that when it comes to being osef the ashes, when it comes to gathering up the ashes, that's also part of the ritual. There, Chere, Shota, V'katan are all possible. And the Chacham say that it says V'lach kulatame me'afaras reifas achatas, that there's a kind of hekesh between the asifa of the ashes and the kiddush into the water. Anyone who's possible for asifa is possible for kiddush as well. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, there's a drasha, V'lach hu, it's a riboy, that even a katan who's possible for asifa is kosher for kiddush. So everyone agrees that all 3 are possible for asifa. Everyone agrees cherish and shota are possible for kiddush. Katan, a minor, is machlokas. Rabbi Yehuda says kosher, the Chacham say possible. Rabbi Yehuda has a drasha, V'lach is a riboy, so why is he marba katan? Why is he not marba the other 2? How did he decide that katan is more worthy of being nisrabe? Tosa says, Mishum da'asi l'chal das. Katan is, all 3 of them are not ordinary, full-fledged, are not full-fledged Yisraelim. They're all lacking something. But a katan is asi l'chal das. He will eventually achieve das and then be an ordinary person. The other 2 are permanently without an unanticipated change. The other 2 are stuck in their not having das. This idea that the katan is somehow different because asi l'chal das is presumably based on a Gemara in Shabbos. The Gemara is discussing someone who's stuck, that he has his belongings on the road and he hasn't gotten home before Shabbos. He has to do something to get his property home. So he can ask a non-Jew, or he can ask, in this particular case, he can ask a cheri shot to the katan. You're normally not allowed to ask a katan to do work for you on Shabbos, but in this particular case, Chazal allowed it. So if a person has a choice between these 3 people, cheri, shota, and katan, which comes first? So the Gemara says, cherish v'shota, shota. Shota comes first, because shota is even more removed from being an ordinary person than cherish is. Katan l'shota, shota v'katan, shota again. Shota is worse than either cherish or katan. But ibayilu, cherish v'katan mai. The third pairing, cherish and katan, which one is considered more of a regular Jew and which less of a regular Jew? So the Gemara says that there's a svara that cherish is worse because katan is asi l'chal das. Katan will eventually have das, so that's as far why katan is someone you should avoid having do malacha for you. So that's as far as Tosa is saying here in Rabbi Yehuda that if we're marba, one person can do the kiddush who can't do the asifa, it's katan because katan is asi l'chal das, so he's closer to being a regular Jew. Rabbi Yitzchak Zilberstein, Chashukei Chemed, talks about medical prioritization, triage. There's a sugya in Harayos. The Gemara talks about different people who have precedence over each other. You can only save one. You have to save one first. Who do you save? So Rav Zilberstein says, what about shota v'katan? If you have a shota and a katan, neither. So he assumes that an adult normal Jew would go ahead of either of them. What about shota v'katan? So he says, based on Aritosis, that katan is asi l'chal das. The Gemara in Shabbos assumes that it's pashut that a shota is less than a katan. The question is only cherish and a katan. But either way, Tosa says that a katan is asi l'chal das, so he's closer to being an ordinary Jew, and therefore, if Zilberstein suggests a great chiddush, he suggests you would save the katan first because he's asi l'chal das. Rav Yaakov Emden had earlier touched on this question in his Biras Migdalos and Evan Bochen. He said cherish and katan do both go before shota. He also assumes, like the Gemara in Shabbos, that shota is less than either cherish or katan. Rav Yaakov Emden doesn't say which one he thinks goes first, cherish or katan. Based on our Gemara in Yoma, we could say that katan is asi l'chal das. The Gemara in Shabbos is not so sure. The Gemara in Shabbos has a question about it, but our Gemara says explicitly that Rabbi Yehuda at least says that katan is better than cherish because he's asi l'chal das. On Daf Mem Daled, the Gemara talks about the shovel that the Kohen would use on an ordinary day. That throughout the year he would use a shovel of kesef to scoop up the coals, because since the coals were hot, they would tend to wear away the that scooping up the coals would impose wear on the shovel, and the shovel would get eaten away and used up. They didn't want to use gold because gold is more precious, gold is more expensive. And therefore we say, Halachos Of the Yisrael. God cares, God has compassion for the money of Klal Yisrael. He doesn't want us to waste our money by using gold for something that will get destroyed relatively easily. This principle of Halachos Of the Yisrael, there are certain halachas that take into account the fact that God doesn't want us to waste our money, comes up in various places in Shas. Rav Asher Weiss has an essay where he points out there is a meta-halachic rule. There are certain cases in halacha where there are opinions both ways, where we say that l'chatchila we're machmer, but we're lenient in the case of hefsid meruba, in the case of great loss. Now, when the poskim articulate this idea that hefsid meruba we can be lenient, they say not just because it's shas chak. Hefsid meruba is a higher standard than shas chak, even in cases where we're not lenient because it's shas chak, but for hefsid meruba, for significant loss, for great loss, we're lenient. Why? Ben Tam says this is based on, in Sefer Yasher Ben Tam, he says it's based on the klal Halachos Of the Yisrael. God doesn't want Jews to lose money. That's a very high value in halacha. Now, if it's usher, it's usher. But when there is basis for leniency, in certain cases we say that that the value of Halachos Of the Yisrael tells us we should be samech on the lenient view in certain cases. Shum Sedeshin says the same thing, even if we're not lenient b'shas chak, but b'makom hefsim meruba, then we have the principle of Halachos Of the Yisrael. Then we can be lenient. On Daf Mem Hey, the Gemara talks about how the Kohanim would ascend and descend the Kevesh, the ramp of the Mizbech. So every day it says the Kohanim would go on the east side of the Kevesh, and on Yom Kippur, because of the cover of the Kohen Gadol, he would just go up and down the center of the Kevesh. Why would they go on the east side of the Kevesh? So this is a rule we've encountered before. Kol pina she'atapone lo yehu ela derech yamin lamizrach. That whenever you have to turn, whenever you have a choice of what direction to go, you always turn to the right, to the east. The Kevesh, Rashi explains, was on the south side of the Mizbech. He would be turning from the south to the east side, turning right. So therefore, they went up on the right side of the Kevesh, because the next turn would be east when they began to circle the Mizbech in a counterclockwise direction. In general, in the United States, we drive on the right side of the road. Many countries do that. Many countries don't do that. The right side, right-hand traffic is more dominant. According to Wikipedia, there are 165 countries and territories that have right-hand traffic. Only 75 use left-hand. If we count by the world's land area, left-hand traffic is only about a sixth, about a third of the population, about a quarter of the roads. Right-hand traffic is substantially more dominant. England and countries that come from England, that's the most common characteristic of a left-hand country, but not exclusively. So why do we drive on the right hand of the road in much or most of the world? Nobody really knows. This rule of the Kevesh seems very much like a right-hand traffic rule. One could have suggested that we don't go in the middle because some Kohanim would be going up and some would be going down. And in order to avoid getting tangled together, we put one on one side and one on the other side. Now you want to know, so if you have to have one side for ascending traffic and one side for descending traffic, how do you know which side is which? There are other Gemaras that say that we have a preference for the right. Even without this rule that you turn to the right, and when you get to the top, you're going to turn on the top. Even without that rule, you're supposed to put on your right shoe first. You're supposed to wash the right limbs of your body first. We could have argued that staying on the right side, if you have to pick one side, staying on the right side is always what we do. We always choose the right. The Gemara here says something different, though. The Gemara here, as explained by Rashi, seems to say that it's not just because we stick to the right, it's because we're going to turn right on the top of the Mizbech, and that's the rule of Kol Pino Shatapona Lo Yehu El Liyamin. Why most of the world uses right-hand traffic, nobody knows. Wikipedia has all kinds of theories about having to do with horses and weapons and so on, but nobody really knows. That is it's not the absolutely dominant, but that is the more common view. That's what they did on the Mizbech as well, except for Yom Kippur. Although in the Mizbech, the reason given by the Gemara is because since they're going to have to turn right on the top of the Mizbech, so that's why they ascend on the right side, because that makes sense if they're going to turn right when they get to the top. On Daf Mem Vav, the Gemara brings a halachic debate, and Rava criticized the opinion of another one of the Amora, and he said, Man hai d'lochayish l'kimche. He didn't approve of what someone else had said. He said that someone who says this is someone who doesn't care about his flour, he doesn't speak precisely, he doesn't care what he says, what he eats, he just says things without careful thought. The language of the Mishnah refutes what he's trying to say, so Rava used this sharp language, this disparaging language, to criticize another Amora. There's a famous tshuva of the Chavos Yar. The Chavetz Chaim quotes it in Hilchos in his Sefer Chavetz Chaim. The Chavos Yar says somebody asked him, Divrei Chacham v'nachas nishma. Chacham is supposed to speak gently in a refined way. Why do we find so many sharp expressions of rejection, of criticism, of contempt, even in the Gemara? The Mishnah says, "Kavod chaveiro should be chavav alecha b'sholcha." That you should have your friend's honor should be as great as your own. We just had the period of Sfira where it says the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva died. They weren't knowing kavod zeh b'zeh. So how can we find kinturim and zalzulim? How can we find so much disparaging language in Chazal? So it's a good question, he says. That's a very good question. Even though it says that when people argue about a matter of Torah, they're like enemies, that's not what Chazal meant. They didn't mean that they use hurtful and abusive language. They're not like, it's not like a bar fight, he says. So what? So it's a very good question. So why do they use such language, he says? So he doesn't mention, as far as I could see, this Gemara. He mentions a variety of other examples, like Kadnayim B'Shach of Rav, Amar Laham Shmaitz. So Rav must have been asleep when he said this, because when he's awake, he could never have said this. So then he says that's not a criticism, that's actually a differential comment, he says. Rav is so great, Rav's mastery of Torah is so high, he says he never could have said this had he not been asleep. And in practice, it sounds a little bit insulting, but it was meant actually to be a polite way of expressing it. He says in some languages Chazal used were meant to be humorous, they were b'dichusa, he says. He gives different examples, all kinds of different language of various examples. Some were meant to be humorous. Sometimes he says a teacher vis-a-vis a student, it's the teacher's job to reprove a Talmud if he's not learning well, if he's not paying attention. For example, when Rav told Levi, I think the person who says this has no brains in his head. So it's mutter for a Rav to give sharp reproof to his Talmidim, because that's tough love. You want them to learn better. The Rambam paskins this way. He says the Rambam paskins, the Rav is obligated, the Rav is chayav to get angry at his Talmidim if he sees that they're shirking their duty, they're being lazy and delinquent. Because Rav knew that Levi could have done better, because he believed in him. He says he wasn't going to define deviancy downward. He wasn't going to have the bigotry of low expectations. He says you can do better than this, and therefore I'm going to be upset at you if you don't do better. So the Chavos Yair struggles and gives various explanations, all these different explanations for all the different phrases in Chazal. At the end of the day, it's still a little hard to understand how Chazal could talk like this. This example in the Gemara of lo chayish l'kimche is definitely not one of the sharpest expressions in Chazal, but it is nevertheless a somewhat pungent and colorful expression. Someone who says this is lo chayish l'kimche, he doesn't care what he's doing, he doesn't care what he's eating, he just says things without deliberate thought. That's how the Amoram frequently spoke, and we have to see which of the various explanations of the Chavos Yair would explain why Rava was willing to speak so sharply to the person he was criticizing.